It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. For weeks, we had planned our trip to the heart of the Amazon, packing our gear, researching survival tactics, and eagerly anticipating the adventure that awaited us. We were a group of 4, me, Jake, Emma, and Will. Best friends since college, we had often talked about the thrill of venturing into the wilderness away from civilization, into the unknown. The jungle seemed like the ultimate test. We arrived at the trailhead with good spirits and sunshine, and the air was filled with a moisture that seemed almost thick and heavy. The trees loomed around us, some of them so old, their leaves whispering softly as the wind blows past them. As we stepped away on foot, the jungle opened up for us, this tangle of vines and thick underbrush, as well as creatures' noises we'd never heard. We were in deep there. Everything felt alive. The chirping birds far away, the rustling of hidden beasts, and the humidity hugging our skin like a second layer. It was exciting. By the time we set up camp in that tiny clearing, the air pulsed with excitement. We were truly in the wild. "Do you hear that?" Will asked, low and almost a whisper. We all stopped. It wasn't just the standard chorus of jungle sounds. Something felt off, like a pressure in the air, a hum in the trees. But it was nothing we could identify. We laughed it off. "Probably just monkeys or some bird," Jake said, his grin a little edgy. But even then, that unease settled in, and none of us could shake it. The nightfall came fast. The campfire crackled as we sat around it, eating dehydrated meals and telling stories. But the sounds in the jungle grew stranger as the night wore on. At first, it was just a low growl in the distance, like the rumbling of a large animal. But it didn't sound quite right. Then came footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost human. The kind of sound that sends a chill down your spine when you can't place the source. Emma, who had always been the most nervous of us, looked around. Her eyes were wide, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You guys hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Probably just the wind," Will said, but even he didn't sound convinced. I tried to rationalize it, jungle animals, maybe even some local tribesmen. We were in a remote area after all, but as the night deepened, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes that weren't quite right lurking in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to take my mind off it by throwing more wood onto the fire. That didn't work, of course. The noise just went on and on. Something was circling round us. "Let's just go to bed," Jake said. He was looking as uncomfortable as I was, but trying not to show it. We agreed. It wasn't easy to sleep. The following morning, I woke to see an odd sight. The clearing where we had set up camp the night before was eerily still. The air had a damp, stagnant feel to it, and the morning sun did little to chase away the lingering sense of dread. As I stepped out of the tent, I saw something strange. Deep, dark scratches on the trees surrounding our camp. They weren't like the marks animals leave, jagged and rough. These were intentional, cut into with purpose. "Guys, look at this," I said to the others. They came out of their tents, sleep-addled and dazed, but when they saw the marks, their faces went down. They were unmistakable, almost like simple, sharp, angular lines that curled around the trunks of the trees like something had been circling our camp, watching us. "What the hell are those?" Will asked in a low voice, unease etched across it. I shook my head. "I don't know, but they weren't here last night." Jake stepped forward, squinting at the marks. Maybe some local tribes did this. Could be a warning, or maybe just something to mark their territory. But there was something about the symmetry of the scratches, how they seemed to wind in patterns that weren't natural, that made me shiver. "We should leave," Emma said, her voice shaking. Jake looked at her, trying to reassure her. but even his confident exterior was starting to crack. "Let's just keep moving forward. It's probably nothing." But I wasn't so sure. That night, the jungle felt different, more oppressive, more alive. The sounds were louder, more immediate, as if the entire forest was closing in on us. And then, as the darkness swallowed our camp whole, it happened. One of us went missing. It was around midnight, and I was half asleep when I heard Will's voice, urgent and frightened, calling out into the dark. Guys, where are you?" I sat up, pounding hard in my chest. I looked around the camp and didn't see him. His sleeping bag was empty. The tent flap was open. "Will?" I called out. "Will?" Emma screamed, her voice shaking. But there was no response. Not even the normal jungle sounds. Just this stillness, this dead silence. We searched for hours. Our flashlights bobbed through the trees, slicing through the dense underbrush. His voice was gone, as if swallowed whole by the jungle. We found no trace of him. No footprints. No sign of a struggle. Nothing. The next morning, we found something worse than we could have imagined. There, on the edge of the clearing, was a single item, Will's backpack. It was torn, as though it had been dragged through the brush. But there was something far more disturbing about it. The zippers were all pulled open, and the water bottle was gone from inside. His phone, too, the needle spinning wildly. We no longer knew what to think. Our party had been whittled down to 3, and the jungle seemed to be closing in around us. That night, we huddled together, barely speaking to one another. The jungle was alive with sounds of things we couldn't identify. Something was watching us. I felt it in my bones, deep in my gut, as though the very earth beneath our feet was holding its breath. Then, in the distance too far for us to be certain, there was movement. A shape in the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes piercing through the underbrush. "Do you see that?" Emma whispered, her breath shaky. Jake and I both turned towards the glow. It wasn't an animal's eyes, not like anything we'd ever seen before. They were too large, too intense. They blinked slowly as if they were studying us. And then they disappeared. We sat frozen, not daring to move. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then it happened again and again. Eyes, blinking in the dark, too far away to be a human, but too close to be anything else. I was terrified. We all were. It was not until the following afternoon that we were discovered. A small group of locals appeared, trekking through the jungle with machetes, faces grim and weathered. They did not say much initially, but when they got a glimpse of our face pale, exhausted, and on the very edge of hysteria, they knew what to make of it. "Come with us," one of them said in a voice heavy with an accent I could barely decipher. "It is not safe here." We trailed them, relieved but too exhausted to ask any questions. They led us to a small village nestled deep in the jungle. And that's when we heard the stories. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, recounting tales that sent a cold wave over me. The jungle we had ventured into was ancient, and it was cursed. An entity, an ancient jungle spirit, had been known to stalk those who dared to enter its domain. It was said to prey on the curious, those who wandered too far, too deep into the heart of the jungle. The glowing eyes we had seen were not animals. They were the spirits of those who had entered the jungle before us, explorers, travelers, and adventurers who had disappeared without a trace. They were never seen again. "We see them too," the old man said, his face hard. "They follow, they watch, and they take." My blood ran cold. Will, our friend, he had become part of the jungle, part of its endless hunt. And we had barely escaped. The villagers warned us never to return to that place. The jungle had claimed us, but it hadn't finished with us yet. It always watched. And now we would carry its eyes with us, whether we liked it or not. To this day, I feel it. That presence, weight of eyes along my spine, always just above my shoulder's periphery. Never returned to the jungle, none of us have. Still, the jungle has its way of holding on. Sometimes, when the lights are low, I swear I can still see the glow of eyes watching me from the dark. And I know now that I'm never truly alone. Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. The jungle is a place of silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing down on your chest until you can't remember the sound of your own breath. The air, thick with humidity, feels like it's pressing you into the earth. And in that silence, in that stillness, you hear something. A whisper, a footstep, a crack of a branch that shouldn't have been there. It is easy to dismiss it as your imagination at first. A trick your mind plays on you in the crushing heat and exhaustion of days spent trekking through the untamed wilds. But then you find something, a structure half buried in the dense undergrowth, twisted vines creeping around the broken stone walls. You stare at it, confused, your breath catching in your throat. This shouldn't be here. This village doesn't belong in a jungle untouched by modern civilization for over 100 years. And then, as you stand there, frozen with the weight of that discovery, you see them. Eyes, watching you from the shadows, eyes that shouldn't be there, eyes that haven't blinked in ages. They've been waiting for you. The jungle was supposed to be a challenge, a place for adventurers, for those who seek answers, for those willing to push past the limits of human endurance. That's why me, Jack, Sarah, and Tom were here. The jungle had been untouched for over a century, a remnant of an age when explorers mapped the world with the ink of their dreams. But no one had ever dared enter this part of the jungle in more than 100 years. The rumors were too dangerous, the stories too chilling. The map was old, weathered, but it was all we had. On the first day, it was fairly uneventful. We hacked our way through dense vines, the sound of machetes slicing through the air as we continued deeper into the unknown. Sometimes the oppressive heat would break and the jungle would open into a clearing where we could catch our breath and take a long drink of water. By the second day, we began to feel something in the air. It wasn't just the humidity. It was an oppressive feeling that weighed heavier as the hours crept by. The jungle made you feel as though you were unwanted, as though it were closing in around you, watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. That night, sitting by the campfire, Tom opened a cold can of beans and looked at us. His face was pale. "I read about this place," he said in a low voice. "There's talk of a lost tribe. The ones who built this village." I looked over at Jack, who had spent most of the day frowning at the map. "Lost tribe," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, flames dancing in his eyes. "They were supposed to be cannibals. People who vanished without leaving any signs of existence. But there are rumors. Some say they still exist, living in the jungle, hiding from the world, waiting for outsiders like us." I tried to brush it off. The heat, the exhaustion, it was getting to him, but Jack wasn't laughing. Instead, his eyes darkened, and he stood up abruptly. "We'll find out soon enough," he muttered, grabbing his gear. The third day, and the jungle itself began to shift. Trees seemed to reach up above us, and shadows to deepen. The undergrowth thickened till it felt as though we navigated a maze, and silence became suffocating. Then, in late afternoon, we found it, a village, or what remained of it. The buildings were half submerged into the earth, moss and vines covering the crumbling stone walls. Ancient they looked, yet strangely preserved. Time had not ravaged them as it ought to have, as if the jungle had swallowed the village itself, hiding it for all those years, waiting for us to come along and dig it up. "Are we sure this is real?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She was the most nervous of the group, always second-guessing our decisions, but I didn't blame her. This place felt wrong, unnatural. "We need to investigate," Jack said, his voice almost detached, like he was already somewhere else, somewhere deeper. He was the leader of the group, the one with the most experience, and when Jack decided something, we followed. We dispersed and went off to search around the village. Tom and Sarah went off to the left side, while Jack and I headed towards the middle of the ruins. The silence was eerie enough to be maddening. No birds, no insects, no wind. It was as if the air was holding its breath. I saw something then. Something that sent shivers down my spine. A totem. It was crude, made of bones and twisted wood, shaped like a grotesque human figure. Its eyes were large, hollow sockets that seemed to stare into me, and as I reached out to touch it, a cold rush of air swept through the clearing, sending a shiver down my spine. "Jack," I called out, my voice shaking. "You need to see this." Jack appeared moments later, his face twisted in confusion. "It's just a totem, man," he said, waving his hand in dismissal. But I could see the unease in his eyes. "We should get out of here. This place, it's not right." That night, the tension was thick in the air. We set up camp not too far from the edge of the village, close enough to feel the strange tug of the totem without being too close to this place that felt wrong somehow. We ate in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. But as the darkness deepened, the jungle came alive again. Faint whispers, distant, barely audible, floated to us on the breeze. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Tom looked up, his face pale. "Hear what?" The whispers grew louder, like voices echoing from deep within the jungle. The problem was, they sounded human, unmistakably human. "They're too faint to make out, but they're there," I said, my heart pounding. I tried to shake the sense of dread crawling up my spine, but it was impossible. Sarah started to cry quietly, her hand clutching her chest. "It's the tribe. They're watching us." Jack stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Enough. We've got to get out of here. Now." But as we turned to pack our things, we realized that something had changed. The paths we had come in on no longer seemed familiar. The trees loomed larger, the shadows deeper, as if the very jungle had shifted overnight, closing in around us. As we moved through the jungle, panic began to creep in. We could not find our way back. The world around us was distorted, and familiar landmarks were no longer in place. The jungle was alive, a living, breathing entity that seemed to trap us in its grasp. Then we saw them through the trees. Figures, tall, dark shapes that stood unmoving, staring at us. Their faces were painted with strange, unnatural patterns of living totems. They didn't move, but their eyes were on us, and they went right through the shadows. "We need to run," I whispered, but my voice stuck in my throat. Jack turned to me and his face was white, his eyes wide. "They're not human." At that moment, we realized the horrifying truth. These weren't people. These were spirits of the lost tribe that had vanished long ago, trapped in the jungle, waiting for souls to wander into their domain. And now, we had become part of their world. We ran. It wasn't long before we realized something worse than death awaited us. As we stumbled deeper into the jungle, trying desperately to find a way out, we began to see them people, but not alive. The spirits of the tribe, frozen in time, wandering the jungle, their hollow eyes locked on us. Tom was the first to vanish. His screams echoed into night. We could not even find him. We certainly could not save him. The jungle was closing in. And then we realized it was not the flesh and blood that was hunting us down. We had been labeled, selected by the spirits, doomed to be part of the forest forever. Our bodies would grow to be like the totem twisted, ignored part of the wood. The jungle took us all, and there was no running away. I don't know how long it's been since that night. Time has lost meaning here, in the jungle. I am not the same person anymore. I am part of the trees, part of the whispers, part of the spirits that wait for the next group of fools to wander in. And when they do, I will be watching them, waiting for them to join us. The forest was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to disconnect from the world and find some peace in nature. I needed to get away from everything, the noise, the people, the stress of daily life. That was the plan. But nothing in the woods is as it seems, especially not after the sun sets. What started as an escape from my worries quickly turned into a nightmare I couldn't outrun. The gentle sounds of wind rustling through the leaves were replaced by something so much darker, something that followed me home. I thought I was alone. I was wrong. I was wrong. I walked into the campsite when the sun was setting beneath the branches. The air was sharp, piney, fresh. It had been a while since I'd been to a real campsite, just me, a tent, and the forest. The kind of solitude that promised to give me some clarity. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the emotional weight I had been carrying for months. But I needed this time alone. I pitched my tent near a small creek. The sound of water babbling was soothing. Gear was minimal. A sleeping bag, some cans of beans, a flashlight, and a trusty pocket knife. I thought to leave the world behind, to forget everything that had clouded my thoughts. As the evening crept closer and shadows lengthened, however, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Perhaps it was the quiet. The forest was alive, or at least so it usually was, and yet it was now quiet. I could tell my nerves were getting to me, so I worked at starting a small fire. Now, the logs only cracked as they broke under the heat, breaking this unnatural quiet. As the firelight flickered, a rustling noise came from the edge of the trees. Too fast for an animal, too deliberate. I froze, my ears straining for even a hint of it coming again, but nothing did. I stood up and reached into my bag, shining the flashlight at the sound and carefully walking toward the trees. I saw nothing. All there was the deep, heavy shadows of the woods, black and empty. I put it to my imagination. It was a long drive after all. I must have dozed off or something, but the sense lingered. Someone or something was observing me. The first evening elapsed without incident. I went to bed to the dim hooting of an owl, coupled with the gentle chirring of crickets. That was night one. For the second evening, the environment started changing. It all began with the rocks. I had just settled into my tent, preparing for another night of solitude, when I heard it, a soft thud on the side of my tent. Startled, I zipped open the flap and peeked outside. At first I saw nothing. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite bathed in the dull glow of the moon. Then it happened again. Another thud. I saw that this time the small one, about the size of a pebble, was hitting the ground near my fire pit. The rocks did not simply fall, but were thrown. I picked up my flashlight and shone it out across the campsite, my heart racing, no movement. Nothing to show anyone else was there. I walked around the edge of the camp, trying to talk myself into being overreactive, that maybe it was just some animal, raccoon or squirrel, messing with me. But that feeling stayed, a presence just beyond the light, just out of reach. The night grew colder as I went back to my tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something was waiting in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, pulling the zipper tight and curling up in my sleeping bag, determined to sleep through it. But sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the leaves, felt like someone or something was just outside my tent, listening, waiting. The third day came with an unsettling calm. The sun was bright, the birds chirping, and everything seemed normal. But I knew better. Something had shifted in the woods. It wasn't just the rocks anymore. It was the footsteps. They were subtle at first, soft crunching sounds like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. I thought it might be a bear or a deer, but these steps were too calculated, too deliberate. They circled my campsite, and the noises seemed to grow closer as the day wore on. I kept my eyes at the edge of the woods, but every time I glanced over, the space remained empty. I thought I was imagining it. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, the isolation getting to me. But that night, when I returned to my tent after a short walk, the ground was covered in small, perfect impressions of human footprints. They were too symmetrical, too deliberate to be from an animal, and they were too close to my tent. I couldn't help myself. I reached for my flashlight and got out again, my hands shaking. I panned through the woods, casting a beam through the darkness. There was nothing, but the footfalls kept coming. Slow, rhythmic, like someone pacing out of view. It was the fourth night, and everything had gone black. I sat next to the remnants of the campfire that smoldered there in the flickering flames as I tried to distract myself from the anxiety that was growing inside me. The air was thick with silence, almost suffocating. I thought that I could hear a slight laughter from afar, very soft, high-pitched, almost childlike, muted, but unmistakable. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I rose from my sitting position and tried to pick up with my ears to pinpoint the direction of its origin. Again, it was the laughter, louder this time, closer. Wrong. In some way it felt like that twisted knots in my stomach. I felt a rise in hair on my neck as the laughter transitioned into a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew something was watching me. The laughter was joined by a low, almost imperceptible murmuring, like a group of people talking, but too far away to understand. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Grabbed a knife from my pack, sweated palms, and took another step outside my tent. The woods were motionless, dead. Only I wasn't alone in the woods. I was sure of it. Feel that eyes on me, peeking out of the night. Suddenly, a soft rustling came from the trees to my left, too close. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw was the thick blackness of the woods. Was it them? I stayed outside for hours, too afraid to return to my tent. The whispering and laughter continued, though never close enough to reveal where it was coming from. The fifth night, the events grew more intense. The whispers returned, but now they were louder, more distinct, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching the dry leaves underfoot. Someone or something was close. I could feel it, like a presence creeping up behind me just beyond the edge of the light. I spent hours hiding behind trees, watching, listening. There was no way to explain the things happening. The rocks, the footsteps, the laughter, the feeling of being followed. It was like something was toying with me, like a predator circling its prey. That's when I saw them. Just at the edge of my camp, barely visible in the dim light, there were figures. Their shapes were vague, almost translucent in the darkness, but I could make out the outlines of people. No, not people. They were too still, too silent. Their faces, when I tried to focus, were blurred and distorted, like something that wasn't quite human. There were 5 of them. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs were frozen in place as I watched them move around the camp. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the malice radiating from them. I ran. I ran deeper into the forest, my flashlight shaking in my hands, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape them. The whispers followed me. The footsteps followed me. The figures, those things, stayed just out of reach, always watching, always waiting. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. I did not stop until I came out of the forest breathless, my mind screaming for release. I turned back, but the woods were silent once more, empty. I thought I escaped, but when I went home, things weren't the same. I started to see them at the edges of my vision, in the reflections of windows. And the laughter, it still echoed in my ears, soft and faint, as if they were always just behind me, waiting. I learned later that the forest had claimed others before me. Campers, hikers, people who had wandered too far into the woods, only to disappear without a trace. They say they are still there, in the woods, watching and waiting for the next person to stumble into their domain. The unseen campers weren't human beings. They were ghosts trapped in the forest by some tragic, untold incident, bound to haunt whoever dared enter their turf. I thought that I was alone, but I never was. The woods always were watching, and I will never forget what I saw that night. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and one day they will find me again.